I have a dream. Just 4 words delivered in one of the greatest speeches of history more than half a century ago. And even today, when I say those 4 words, if you have any sense of history at all, you don't hear them in my voice. You don't hear them in my speech. You hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I can't stand in shoes so big. Let's hear it from Dr. King himself.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
In Australia, you have to work a little harder to find truly great oration. The best known is probably Gough Whitlam's pithy statement when he announced that he had been dismissed as Prime Minister.
Well may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General. The proclamation which you have just heard read by the Governor-General's official secretary was countersigned Malcolm Fraser. Who will undoubtedly go down in Australian history from Remembrance Day 1975 as Kerr's Kerr.
For my money, though, the greatest speech was that of Paul Keating, a Prime Minister that I never personally actually that much liked. But his eulogy to the unknown soldier was just stirring and marvellous and wonderful.
We do not know this Australian's name, and we never will. We do not know his rank or his battalion. We do not know where he was born or precisely how and when he died. We do not know where in Australia he had made his home or when he left it for the battlefields of Europe. We do not know his age or his circumstances, whether he was from the city or the bush, what occupation he left to become a soldier, what religion, if he had a religion, if he was married or single. We do not know who loved him or whom he loved. If he had children, we do not know who they are. His family is lost to us as he was lost to them. We will never know who this Australian was. Yet he has always been among those we've honoured. We do know that he was one of the 45,000 Australians who died on the Western Front, one of the 416,000 Australians who volunteered for service in the First World War, one of the 324,000 Australians who served overseas in that war, and one of the 60,000 Australians who died on foreign soil, one of the 100,000 Australians who have died in wars this century. He is all of them, and he's one of us. This Australia and the Australia he knew are like foreign countries. The tide of events since he died has been so dramatic, so vast and all-consuming, a world has been created beyond the reach of his imagination. He may have been one of those who believed the Great War would be an adventure too grand to miss. He may have felt that he would never live down the shame of not going. But the chances are that he went for no other reason than he believed it was his duty, the duty he owed his country and his king. Because the Great War was a mad, brutal, awful struggle distinguished more often than not by military and political incompetence, because the waste of human life was so terrible that some said victory was scarcely discernible from defeat, and because the war, which was supposed to end all wars, in fact sowed the seeds of a second, even more terrible war, we might think that this unknown soldier died in vain. But in honouring our war dead, as we always have, we declare that this is not true. For out of the war came a lesson which transcended the horror and tragedy and the inexcusable folly. It was a lesson about ordinary people, and the lesson was that they were not ordinary. On all sides, they were the heroes of that war, not the generals and the politicians, but the soldiers and sailors and nurses, those who taught us to endure hardship, show courage, to be bold as well as resilient, to believe in ourselves, to stick together. The unknown Australian soldier we inter today was one of those who by his deeds proved that real nobility and grandeur belongs not to empires and to nations, but to the people on whom they, in the last resort, always depend. That is surely at the heart of the Anzac story, the Australian legend which emerged from the law. It's not a legend. It's a legend not of sweeping military victories so much as triumphs against the odds, of courage and ingenuity in adversity. It is a legend of free and independent spirits whose discipline derive less from military formalities and customs than from the bonds of mateship and the demands of necessity. It is a democratic tradition, the tradition in which Australians have gone to war ever since. This unknown Australian is not interred here to glorify war over peace or to assert a soldier's character above a civilian's, or one race or one nation or one religion above another, or men above women, or the war in which he fought and died above any other war, or of one generation above any that has or will come later. The unknown soldier honours the memory of all those men and women who laid down their lives for Australia. His tomb is a reminder of what we've lost in war and what we have gained. We've lost more than 100,000 lives, and with them all their love of this country and all their hope and energy. But we've gained a legend, a story of bravery and sacrifice, and with it a deeper faith in ourselves and our democracy, and a deeper understanding of what it means to be Australian. It's not too much to hope, therefore, that this unknown Australian soldier might continue to serve his country. He might enshrine a nation's love of peace and remind us that in the sacrifice of the men and women whose names are recorded here, there is faith enough for all of us.
Gosh, I wish I could speak like that, like any of those. You see, in our system of law, everything comes down to one question. How persuasive can you be? How well can you persuade the judge? How well can you persuade the jury? How well can you persuade the other side? G'day everyone, Anthony Marinac here. Welcome to the second video in Module 4 of our Introduction to Law. In the first module, we went through the Iraq process of legal reasoning. In my view, that's the best way to organise your legal analysis and present it in a way that is compelling and well reasoned. The problem is that our system of justice is adversarial. Very rarely will you get the chance to go before the courts and just simply make your argument. Almost always, there will be someone there to oppose you. And if they have a legal representative, then they too will have worked out their own Iraq. They'll be there to show the judge that their reasoning is better than yours, and you'll be there trying to show the opposite. Ultimately, everything you do in litigation comes down to advocacy. How well can you persuade someone else to agree that you are right. That's what we're going to look at in this video. In a legal context, the word advocacy is often used in a very specific way to mean the sort of work done by barristers in courts. However, in reality, advocacy starts at the very start of a new legal matter. For instance, let's think about the matter that we were dealing with in our previous video. Now, the first step would be almost certainly to write to each of the other parties. They might write to us first, or we might write to them first. Either way, our objective would be the same, to try to persuade them not to proceed with what would be a long and costly legal battle, even if we win. So we might send the customer a letter saying that whilst we don't believe it was necessarily our iced latte that caused the sickness, we do feel bad for her and we want to offer her some nominal sum, say $500, to avoid the need to have to prove our innocence in court. And in addition, that any damage to her car really wasn't our fault, even if the iced latte was the cause of the illness. Can you see how a letter of this type has nothing to do with an actual court proceeding, but it's definitely advocacy? Advocacy therefore occurs at any time that you are speaking to or writing to another party or to an authority in order to try to persuade them that your client is right and that your client should get what they want. In my view, you should therefore treat every single piece of advocacy as though you were appearing in the High Court. Because whatever it is that your client needs, it's important enough to them that they came to see a lawyer about it. Naturally, of course, there is spoken courtroom advocacy. Many of you will do a unit on advocacy later in your degrees, and those of you who plan to go to the bar will do extensive training in advocacy as part of becoming a barrister. At this stage, we're going to look at some of the basics, just so that you have your head wrapped around the idea of what advocacy is and how it works. Now, I wish that I was able to give you some simple little pattern like IRAC to follow for advocacy. However, it doesn't work like that. You see, advocacy occurs in a dynamic environment. Your own strategies and efforts may well be affected by whatever your opponent is doing. Instead, I'm going to offer a number of tips and suggestions for stronger advocacy. The first tip is to know the facts deeply. Now, this one sounds a bit obvious, right? But it's crazy how often arguments can be won and lost because one advocate understood the facts better than the other one did. You need to know everything relevant about the situation which gives rise to the legal dispute and the people within dispute. Now, there are various ways to do this. My favourite way is this. I start by making a list of the important characters, as though the whole situation was a play. So in our iced latte example, there are three important characters. There is the manager, who is our client, the customer, who is our opponent, and the barista, who is our other opponent. In more complex cases, there may be a dozen or more different characters. For each character, I give a very concise overview of who they are and why they matter. So, the manager is our client, 44, male, owned the business for 7 years, not present during the sale of the iced latte, knew of the issue with the fridge but didn't replace it, and acknowledges that he dismissed the employee. The customer is our opponent. She's 32, female, performs home duties. She claims she drank the iced latte and contracted food poisoning. She claims a sudden bout of illness caused vomiting. She claims the vomiting caused a car accident and she's seeking damages. The barista is our opponent. She's 21, female, former employee of our client, dismissed after a series of poor performance issues, specifically dismissed after the iced latte incident. She claims she was unfairly dismissed and claims the fridge was responsible, and she's likely seeking damages. So you can see that from this list of characters, we can see who's who in the zoo and how they all fit together. The next step, the most important step, is to create what's called a chronology. The way I do this is to divide the page in half and to list the incidents one by one on the left side and on the right side to indicate the evidence. In other words, how do we know that each of these events happened? So for the latte example, it might look something like this. In October 2010, the cafe was opened by our client. We know that from our client's statement. Around about August 2017, the refrigerator became unreliable and morning checks of the temperature commenced. We know this from both our client's statement and also the barista's statement. 16th of February 2017, the barista commenced employment. We know this from the firm's records. 11th of October 2017, at 7 a.m, the barista checked the fridge temperature. We know that from her statement. At 11:25, the customer purchased the latte. We know that from the receipt. 2:10 in the afternoon, the customer had the vehicle accident. We've got that from her statement. 4:15 p.m, the customer's food poisoning was diagnosed. We've got a doctor's report for that. Then on the 12th of October at 9:30, the customer approached the client to complain. We've got that from the client's statement. Again, this is a very simple case, but you can see that by doing this, we've really clearly laid out the concepts of the facts of the case. So now we know who the people are and what the events are that those people participated in. It's important to note, though, that this is a minimum. The more that you know about the events you're focusing on, the better. Second hint for advocacy: know your strengths and weaknesses and also know theirs. One of the biggest mistakes people make in advocacy situations is to start behaving as though our side is entirely right and the other side is entirely wrong. It's almost like a part of people's brain switches off once they're in a conflict situation. The whole world becomes my side versus their side, and my side must be right. Their side must be wrong. Well, the real world and real legal disputes are seldom like that. And real legal disputes are adversarial. So you're going to be squaring up to an opponent whose sole purpose is to show the court that they're right and you're wrong. So it's not enough to focus on your strengths and their weaknesses. You also need to focus on their strengths and your weaknesses. You should be thinking, how do we confront their strengths? How do we protect our weaknesses? And why are we still right despite those weaknesses? So let's think again about the iced latte scenario, and in particular, let's think about the case brought by the customer. What are the customer's biggest strengths? Well, first and foremost, the customer does really seem to have had food poisoning. That is obviously going to help them and harm us. They have a doctor's certificate, so the evidence seems pretty good. So whatever argument we make, it's going to have to accommodate the fact that they really did have food poisoning. Okay, so what are the customer's biggest weaknesses? Well, I'd say there are three. First up, they can't really show that the food poisoning was caused by our iced latte. They say they hadn't eaten anything else, but that's exactly what we'd expect someone to say if they were trying to ensure that they could pin the blame on someone specific. It seems pretty odd that they hadn't eaten anything at all by that time of the day. Second, they can't actually demonstrate through evidence that they vomited while driving, or that the vomiting was sudden, or that the vomiting caused the accident. She could have just not been paying attention, she might have been fiddling with her phone, who knows? And unless the other side can actually link the vomiting to the accident, well, that part of their case falls over. Finally, they have a weakness in terms of damages because they can't show that the damage to the car flowed naturally from the breach or that it should have been within the contemplation of the parties. See our IRAC analysis coming to the fore in all of these? Okay, so what about us? What are our strengths and our weaknesses? Well, it's pretty hard to see anything we could really call a strength. We could argue that our shop meets all of the necessary standards for food hygiene, but that's not really a strength. We haven't really got any evidence to disprove the theory being offered by the other side. We can't show that the food poisoning came from some other source. We can't show that the car accident had some other cause. So our strengths are a bit thin on the ground. What then are our weaknesses? Well, the biggest weakness is that darn fridge. Had the fridge been working fine, we'd be in a much stronger position. Even if the fridge was not working, but there was a more effective way of maintaining control of the temperature, then we'd be okay. However, the system described to us by the client is a bit dodgy, really, because the fridge could have gone off and back on in the middle of the night, and we'd never know. Okay, so now we know where we stand. We know our strengths and weaknesses, and we know theirs. And they have got a case, a really genuine case with a chance of winning. No point pretending otherwise. That doesn't mean we're going to throw in the towel, of course, but at least now we know what we're confronting. Next thing to consider. What is the audience, and how should the argument be presented? You see, legal advocacy has a few different audiences. Sometimes you're going to be advocating to your own client to help them see that the decision they want to take is not in their best legal interests. Sometimes you're going to be advocating to your opponent to suggest to them that your case is strong and their case is weaker, and that the two sides should be working together towards a settlement. Sometimes you're going to be advocating to a jury made up of ordinary people doing their level best to try to undertake an unfamiliar and difficult role. Sometimes you're going to be advocating to a magistrate who has 45 other matters on the list and wants you out of the way as quickly as possible. Sometimes you're going to be advocating to a judge who has a little more time at their disposal. And if you're really lucky, someday in the future you may end up advocating to a full bench in a major appeals court case. Even outside the court, you may put in a submission to a Law Reform Commission report, or to an exposure draft, or a Senate committee inquiry. All of these are forms of advocacy, and they all speak to different audiences. So there's a few things to think about in terms of your audience. The first is to think about what your specific audience can actually accomplish. In other words, what are you asking them to do? Because you might be spectacularly successful at convincing them of the need to do something which they're completely unable to do. If that's the case, you haven't really accomplished anything. The second thing to ask yourself is how much background your audience is likely to have on the topic at hand, and what sort of background they might have. Because your advocacy is going to have to be more detailed in areas where your audience has little knowledge, and less detailed in areas where your audience has considerable knowledge. So, for instance, in our example, the manager is really not going to need us to explain how coffee shops work. Instead, he will need much more explanation about how the law itself works. If we get to court, though, the judge would need much less explanation about the law and much more explanation about how coffee shops work. The third thing to think about is the correct tone for your audience. Speaking to your client, you would want to come across as helpful. Speaking to your opponents, you might want to come across as assertive and confident. Speaking to a judge, it's always best to aim for professional and respectful. Speaking to a jury, you might want to seem approachable. The fourth thing to think about is the language that you use. The reality is that different audiences use different language. When speaking to other lawyers, you can assume that they all have strong language skills and a solid understanding of legal jargon. But you'll be dealing with clients from 100 different occupations, and each of those clients has their own unique skill set. Their specific skill set might not include strong language skills. You have to try really hard to hit the sweet spot so that you're not condescending or as though you're talking down to someone, and you're not speaking in a way that's too complicated, so you end up going right over their heads. The final thing to remember is that not all of your clients will have English as a first language, and some of your clients are likely to have disabilities which will interfere with their communication. If you're the one advocating, if you're trying to convince them, then it's your responsibility to meet their specific communication needs. Because if you don't, then your message doesn't get through and you might as well have just not bothered showing up. The next thing I want to talk about is logic. Now, this video is way too short for me to try to explain deductive and inductive logic to you, but it's a fascinating field and one which would be profitable for any lawyer to give some time to. Essentially, though, logic is a process of building a number of statements towards an inevitable conclusion. The idea being that if you can prove that all of those statements, which we call premises, are true, then your conclusion must also be true. Let me give you an example from our latte scenario. The food poisoning argument goes like this. The first premise, iced lattes are made with milk. The second premise, if milk is too old or incorrectly stored, it develops bacteria or it goes off. Third premise, if the milk has gone off, it's not safe to consume. Fourth premise, consuming milk which has gone off causes food poisoning due to the bacteria. Fifth premise, the milk in the iced latte was off. Sixth premise, the customer drank the milk. Seventh premise, the customer got food poisoning. The conclusion is the off milk in the iced latte caused the food poisoning. Now, if we return to our usual position with the manager as our client, we'd have to admit that that initially sounds like a pretty strong argument for the customer, until we look a little more closely. You see, there's a couple of problems. The first one is that we only agree with 6 out of the 7 premises. We don't necessarily agree with the 5th premise that the milk in the iced latte was off. It's surprising how many arguments are like this, where the parties actually agree on virtually everything, but the one point of disagreement is the only point that really counts. You see, if the milk in the iced latte was not off, well then the rest of their argument kind of falls apart, really, doesn't it? So that's the point we need to attack. Can you see how reducing the argument to its logical elements allows us to do this? Second, we don't necessarily agree that all those premises add up to that conclusion. So even if the 5th premise turns out to be true, even if the milk in the iced latte was off, it would still be possible for the food poisoning to have happened as a result of something else. Maybe she didn't wash her hands properly. Maybe she ate half-cooked chicken. Maybe she ate some Chinese food that had been sitting in the serving tray too long. Can you see how if we inserted an additional premise in there, premise 8, to say many other things are capable of causing food poisoning, then the conclusion wouldn't follow at all? Again, a careful look at the logic of the arguments being put forward is often the best way to work out what points you should attack and how hard you should attack them. The other side of logic is what we call fallacies. Now, in the world of formal logic, the word fallacy has a particular meaning. The general use of the word is a bit broader, and it refers to any type of argument which is asserted as being logically sound, but which is actually not logically sound. Let me explain a couple of the more common ones that you might want to watch out for. The first one is called the straw man fallacy, or more correctly, knocking down a straw man. This occurs when your opponent misrepresents your argument and then they attack their version of your argument, not yours. It looks something like this.
The marks of our male students has really been dropping. We probably should look at something to address this.
So we should just ignore the needs of our female students? This isn't a competition between genders, you know. And what about transgender students?
See how it works? The first person certainly never said resources should be withdrawn for women or transgender students. And in fact, the second person hasn't actually addressed the point at all. They've really just squawked around and made a bunch of pointless noise. The second fallacy I want to talk about is called the false dichotomy fallacy, or sometimes it's called the black and white fallacy. This occurs when someone tries to establish a situation as though there were only two possibilities, when in fact there are many more.
If you try to take away our guns, then you're on the side of the terrorists. You are either with us, or you're with them.
Do you think it might be possible for me to be against gun nuts, but also against terrorists?
Third, there's the bandwagon fallacy, which suggests that because something is popular, it must also be right. Or it tries to make an argument strong by suggesting that many people also hold that position.
Look, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and they all seem to think that taxes should be lower. In fact, last night I saw a low tax meme on Facebook with more than 1 million likes. Can they all be wrong?
The last one that we'll look at, although there's many others to discover, is called post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for after it, therefore because of it. This is the idea that because one event followed another one in time, the first event must have caused the second one.
Everything has been awful since she took over. So much more work, so much more confusion. Everything is just terrible. I just wish she'd never become the boss.
Look, things have been hard since she took over, and she can be difficult. But you've got to consider the fact that since she became the boss, we've had an overhaul of regulations in our sector. There's been a massive market crash which has affected everybody, including us. And we went through the busiest trading period of the year, right?
I don't care. It's only happened since she came along.
See the problem? It's easy to assume that because one thing follows another, they must be connected. But there's often actually no reason at all for this to be the case. This is particularly important in legal cases. Think about the iced latte example we've been using. The vomiting came after the iced latte, and our opponent is suggesting that the iced latte caused the vomiting. Can you see post hoc ergo propter hoc here? Unless they can actually show that the iced latte caused the vomiting, then there's no necessary relationship between them at all. Can you see how important it is to learn about these fallacies and practice spotting them? They are devilish because at first blush, they seem so logical. It doesn't actually seem like the other party is putting one over you, even though in fact they totally are. Okay, let's get away from logic a little bit and think about presentation. Let's say you have your argument, you know your strengths and weaknesses, and you know theirs. You've thought about your audience, you've built your argument logically, and you've analysed the logic of the other side to make sure that there are no fallacies lurking in there. What are some of the things you can do to make your argument stronger? Well, the first thing I want to talk about is the use of analogies. Analogies are a logical device where you use one thing to explain another. Often the analogy is something which is entertaining or easy to understand, and which then provides a key to understanding the more complicated concept that you're actually trying to explain. For instance, if I was going to describe the process of teaching, I might do it something like this. When the student comes along, they're a bit like a seed, newly planted in the soil. All the potential is there, but nothing has happened yet. As a teacher, my job is to be the gardener, provide water every day, plenty of sunshine, keep the pests away, talk to the plant on a regular basis, and watch it grow, little by little, day by day, until that tiny seed turns into something spectacular. Can you see how, by talking about seeds and plants, I'm actually making a much more serious point about the way that I believe teachers should approach teaching? Analogies are an extremely powerful weapon of advocacy, and analogic reasoning is actually a very important part of the law. We use it in two ways. First, it's very useful when your audience is not legally trained, for instance, a jury or a client. One of the skills of advocacy is being able to explain your position convincingly to someone who may struggle to understand even the most basic concepts. For instance, you might remember way back in Module 1 when you yourself had far less legal knowledge than you do now. I used Sully and the Flight of United 1549 as an analogy to explain the nature of jurisprudence. The Miracle on the Hudson was easier to understand, and it allowed me to make some pretty clear points about the nature of jurisprudence. Second, if you think about it, a great deal of the process of stare decisis is actually argument by analogy. When we look at old cases, we're almost never going to come across cases where the facts are identical to ours. Instead, we're looking at those old cases and asking whether they are similar in relevant ways to the case we are looking at. So we might be dealing with a case involving the sale of a car, but we might be looking to a precedent which involved the sale of waistcoats. The ability to look at an old precedent and to explain the analogy to a court, to explain what can be learned from the old precedent, is a very powerful technique of advocacy. Now we're nearly there, but there's a couple more things I want to tell you about. Next is the rule of threes. This is a principle that seems to have started in the world of sales, but it's now quite commonly used, particularly by barristers. The rule is pretty simple. When someone has heard something 3 times, particularly if those 3 are close together, it tends to stick. You see people do this all the time in advertisements. Let's have a look at this ad for the cereal All Bran.
What you got there?
All Bran honey almond.
All Bran?
Yeah, All Bran. It's delicious.
Malicious. Tall Jan is malicious.
What?
I heard what you said. Tall Jan is malicious.
No, I said All Bran is delicious.
All Bran is delicious. You expect me to believe that?
Yeah.
Pathetic.
It is. Honey, an almond, All Bran is delicious.
All Bran honey almond. You won't believe the
Notice
taste.
how many times they say the words All Bran is delicious? The repetition helps you to learn. And the minimum number for the repetition to count is 3 times. No matter how effectively you say something, if you say it once, it will be less effective than if you say it 3 times. Imagine you were in the iced latte scenario, but arguing for the customer. You might say to a jury, "We know the milk in the iced latte shouldn't have been used because the fridge was unreliable." Now that doesn't sound too bad, does it? But listen to this. Ladies and gentlemen, how do we know the milk in the iced latte shouldn't have been used? Well, we know the milk in the iced latte shouldn't have been used because the fridge was unreliable. That's how we know the milk in the iced latte shouldn't have been used. Now that example is perhaps laid on a bit thick, but you can see the point. The main message is transmitted 3 times, so it begins to be repetitive, and therefore it sticks. This works even better in a dialogue situation, such as cross-examination or negotiation, especially when the other side is trying to avoid answering you. Have a listen.
Mr. Smith, you didn't pay that bill, did you?
You should have seen the way he treated me. It was appalling.
Mr. Smith, what I put to you was, did you pay the bill?
Look, there are certain ways we're supposed to treat each other in this industry, and he didn't do that.
Mr. Smith, you're trying very hard to avoid answering my question. That's because you didn't pay the bill, did you?
I don't think I had to.
That means no, doesn't it? You didn't pay the bill.
Can you see how, as a listener to that conversation, the only thing that really sticks out is that Smith didn't pay the bill? Repetition is a beautiful thing, and the rule of 3 says that if you can say something 3 times, that's the point at which it begins to really stick. The final thing about spoken advocacy takes us back to some of the material we covered with IRAC. And that's the importance of a conclusion. Your advocacy really must finish up with a strong statement that pulls together logically everything that you've been developing in your argument. You should be able to encapsulate your entire argument in just a sentence or 2, in a way that seems so compelling that the listener can't even see an alternative. For the iced latte example, we might say something like this. Your Honour, the ultimate question in this case is whether the plaintiff's illness was caused by the iced coffee or by some other cause. She has not been able to show any causal link between the iced coffee and the illness. She has simply presumed that because the illness followed the coffee must have been responsible. as she has not been able to close this vital link in her argument must fail. Now, your conclusion in any piece of advocacy will aim to convince the listener to either do something or agree to something. Otherwise, honestly, there's very little point in advocating at all. So there's some basics of advocacy. Later in your degree, you will most likely undertake a whole subject called advocacy, in which you will learn much more about advocacy, and specifically advocacy in court. Can you see, though, how all of this builds? In Module 2 and Module 3, you learned how to find the law and about legislation and cases. At the start of this module, you learned about the process of IRAC reasoning, which lets you put all of that law into a specific problem situation. Now you've learned what to do with that analysis, how to begin to package it up into a compelling argument which will convince listeners that you're right and that they should agree with you. In the final video in this module, we're going to look over the field of evidence. Now, evidence is also an advanced subject that you will do later in your degree. But it's important from the very start of your legal studies that you should be thinking about the fact that facts are not just spun out of the void. The court accepts facts because a party can provide evidence of those facts. Besides which, evidence law is kind of cool. See if you agree.